Well, hello, Kids Cook Real Food. Katie Kimball here for the Healthy Parenting Connector, where we strive to connect parents who really want to raise healthy kids with the experts who have the information they need. Today, I'm honored to host Dr. Kay Toomey, who is an expert, 30-year expert in picky eating, sort of. Thanks for being here, Dr. Toomey.
Great. Thank you for inviting me. This is wonderful.
I think this is going to be an incredibly helpful topic for people. We're talking about the difference between picky eaters and problem feeders. And
Yep.
if you've never heard that second term, that's why you're here. Keep watching. And we'll get into really practical solutions too, because I'm all about education, but if we don't know how to apply it, it doesn't
Right.
mean that much.
Exactly.
So let me introduce you to my audience, Dr. Toomey. So Dr. Toomey is a pediatric psychologist, worked with children who don't eat for almost 30 years. Not that the children aren't eating for 30 years. She has 30 years of experience, but if you have one of those kids, I'm sure those words just like set fear into your heart. It's such a stressful idea, these children who don't eat. And Dr. Toomey developed the SOS approach to feeding. It's a family-centered program for assessing and treating children with these feeding problems, and she has national esteem. She speaks all over the place and is a consultant to Gerber Products, which is pretty cool. And she's even helped to form the Children's Hospital of Denver's pediatric oral feeding clinic. And just, I mean, you can tell like your hands are in a lot of places in a lot of states, Dr. Toomey. So again, I'm so
Over the
honored to have
years.
you here.
Over the
Yes.
years.
Yes. So now you have your own feeding clinic, promoting and sharing these SOS feeding solutions for 6 to 8 years, it looks like.
So yeah, I was at a children's hospital, and then I was at a private hospital, and then I went into private practice, and I've had a couple of different private practices.
Yes, and I found Dr. Toomey because her team actually reached out to me to see if they could incorporate Kids Cook Real Food just as sort of a resource, because you have this amazing program, Dr. Toomey, and I started reading the testimonials of these children who just wouldn't eat. I mean, some of them are teens when they come to you.
Yes, they
And
are.
they've eaten like 5 foods their entire life, and your methods work. So we have got to dive right in, but let's start with the vocabulary. What's the difference between a picky eater versus a problem feeder, just so we all have the same language?
If I can, I want to step us back for just a couple of seconds and look at feeding and eating from a big global perspective, because a lot of times when children don't eat well, people think that that's a behavioral problem. And of course, as parents, when somebody tells us our kids have a behavioral problem, oftentimes what we hear is we're bad parents, or we just have a stubborn, obnoxious, willful little brat who isn't eating to make everybody mad, right? That's what we hear when
It's
people
a
say our
personal
kids have
affront,
a
yeah.
behavioral problem. So the thing is, when children don't eat well, whether they're picky eaters or whether they're a problem feeder, it's because something about their body isn't quite working correctly. And eating is the only thing you do as a human being that involves all 7 areas of human function. It makes it the hardest thing you will ever do in your entire lifetime. We just all think it's easy because we've been doing it since we were babies, right? And we know there are 5 major developmental transitions in feeding across the first 10 years of your life.
Wow.
And if something about your body is a little bit off, including a little bit of your development being off, you're going to kind of get hit when you get to one of those developmental transition time periods. And so what happens when things aren't quite going correctly physically, developmentally, is you get to those transition time periods. Instead of sailing through them, you start to get tripped up. And so that's what creates picky eaters and problem feeders. So when kids don't eat well, it's all in their body. It is not all in their heads. And there's a lot of people out there who say, ugh, all kids are picky, they'll all outgrow it. It's just you guys as his parents' fault. And what the research actually shows is that we as parents are causing our kids picky eating or their problem feeding in only about 5 to 10% of the time.
Wow.
And so when we go out and teach other professionals, the first thing I tell them is if we as professionals are assuming these kids aren't eating because of their parents, we're going to be wrong 90 to 95% of the time. So don't go there because you're probably
Right.
wrong. It's much more complicated than that. So we want to think first about what are those developmental transition time periods.
Okay, so you're saying the genesis of any sort of feeding issue, whether it's picky or
Problems, yeah.
problem, and
Yep.
they're sort of on a range, is the same. It's in the body, and so that's going to dictate our solution.
Absolutely. Very good. Absolutely. So the first one is related to this idea that eating's automatic, it's instinctive, everybody does it no matter what. And actually your appetite instinct drives your eating only for the first 4 to 6 weeks of your life.
Weeks? What?
Weeks. It's the only time where your appetite is the primary driver of your eating. So you can't use that as an excuse anymore for overeating as a grown-up, that, oh, it's just instinct. So
Oh dear.
um, after 4 to 6 weeks of age, and that's the first transition, there's a lessening of the appetite instinct, and your primitive motor reflexes that you should be born with are going to take over as the primary driver of eating. And so, for example, we have grasping reflexes, suck, swallow, breathe reflexes. They're there from birth, but it's that appetite instinct that really drives it at first. And then the reflexes become the major driver. Most of us are familiar with the rooting reflex. If you stroke a baby's cheek, they will turn and open their mouth. So those reflexes are going to drive your eating until about 4 to 6 months of age. Around 4 to 6 months of age, your reflexes start to come under voluntary control, so that after 6 months of age, eating is actually a learned behavior. And you either learn to eat, you learn to not eat, you learn to kind of sort of eat. That's it. Those are your 3 choices.
Okay.
And so that learning is important, and we're going to come back to that when we talk about what parents can do.
Okay. That
So
first transition, not to interrupt too much, but that first transition from appetite to reflexes, I'm guessing there's not a whole lot of environmental play there at all?
no, there
Okay.
really is not. That is driven by the baby's body.
We
And
can't screw that one up.
nope, nope. And
Yes.
as long as their reflexes are solid,
Right.
and unfortunately, some of our kids born premature, their reflexes aren't solid.
Okay, so we
Um,
can have a falling off of the
yeah,
system even at that stage.
yes, yes. So when the appetite becomes less, if the reflexes, I'm sorry, aren't working as solidly as they should, you can see some difficulties start right there. The
Got it.
bigger age of difficulty is when you lose those reflexes for eating and you have to do it all on your own. And that's why you either learn to eat, you learn to not eat, or you learn to kind of sort of eat. And so we know that eating is a learned behavior after 6 months of age. So we need to understand what we're teaching our children. Many of us as parents come to the table being dietitians. Did my child eat enough calories? Did they get enough calcium? Are they getting enough zinc? We need parents not to come to the table being dietitians. We need them to come to the table being teachers. If their children are struggling with their eating, that means their child is learning something that's getting in the way of their eating. And oftentimes they're learning those things because the body isn't quite doing what it's supposed to. But that's where sometimes we as parents end up contributing. So while we don't cause our kids feeding problems for the most part, there are things we can do to make it better. And unfortunately, there are things we do that makes it worse.
Okay, do we get
And
to hear any practical examples
we
at that
are.
stage?
We are
Good.
gonna talk about some of those. So what we want to think about as we talk about picky eaters versus problem feeders is that the kids who are really having very mild issues, they're the ones who are going to learn to kind of sort of eat a little bit. but oftentimes they're going to do it in very specific ways. Like they don't want to chew anything that's really hard to chew. And so they avoid what we call real meat. Now, when I talk about real meat, I mean like a breast of chicken, a pork chop, a steak. I don't mean chicken nuggets, fish sticks, hot dogs, bologna.
I think we're on the same page there, Kay.
We call those pre-chewed meat because the manufacturer chops them up somewhere in the plant, makes them into whatever shape they want, and throws some breading on it, even better. But when kids are struggling with their chewing, those foods they're going to gravitate to because they've been pre-chewed.
Yeah, they're easy. We all gravitate toward what's easy at a certain point.
Exactly. Yeah. So if I'm having some sensory difficulties, for example, where I don't like the way certain things feel, like things that are maybe wet, I think are slimy, and so now I'm not going to want to do the applesauce. I'm not going to want to do spaghetti sauce on my pasta. I'm not going to want to do yogurt or things like that we do want our kids to eat, but it's a sensory issue because they don't like the way it feels. Sometimes it's a taste issue where they don't like what the taste is. We all have different kinds of taste preferences, and we know that many vegetables are actually bitter. And not only are they bitter, but they're also stringy and very fibrous. And so vegetables have a double whammy against them because they can have a sensory issue for kids and they can have a chewing issue for kids. It's one of the reasons why we asked you if we could use your program as one of our resources, because you do such a lovely job of helping kids how to cook different things to make them taste good and make them easier to chew and work well in their mouths. And
yeah,
so
we try to make it so easily accessible.
Right. That's what we love about your program. But those are some things for parents to think a little bit about when their kids are rejecting of food. What is it about the food that's the problem? Not what is it about my child that's necessarily the problem, but what is it about the food that's hard for my child? And is there a match between what works well for my child and a mismatch between what I'm trying to feed them as a parent? And that's one of the places we as parents can kind of get ourselves tripped up. So if our kids' development, if something about their body isn't quite working right, and we are trying to feed them really hard to chew foods that are super bitter, the kids are going to reject them. And then we begin to start to have this power struggle. And the next big time in development where kids' feeding can really start to falter and fall off is around 12 to 14 months when kids become self-aware. And once they become self-aware, they figure out they have an opinion they can express. And so we may want them to eat one kind of food, and they've decided that's too hard for their body. And now we have some headbutting going on. And unfortunately, it just gets worse in the terrific twos. And so that's our next big developmental transition time point is 2 to 3 years of age. The next one's going to be around 5 to 6, and the next one's actually going to be around 9, 10. So unfortunately, we're not out of the woods until our kids turn into preteens, early teenagers.
And then we have all of that set of power struggle problems.
I know. So that's why we think about picky eaters versus problem feeders. What we know from the research is not all kids are picky. What the research shows is only about a third of children are actually going to develop picky eating. Unless you're talking about your terrible twos, in the 2 to 3 year age range, 50% of kids are going to struggle with picky eating. And it's because developmentally, it's one of those big transition time periods. But for the most part, on average, about a third of kids are going to struggle with picky eating. So it's not that all kids are picky. And it's not also true that all kids outgrow their picky eating. Only about 25% of kids who have picky eating actually outgrow it. And it's because we as parents aren't understanding what's driving their picky eating. And so we can't be as helpful as what we would like to be. Now, what
Okay.
the research also shows is about 5 to 10% of kids will be problem feeders and struggle with problem feeding. And so the problem feeding kids are the kids who have bigger developmental issues,
Mm-hmm.
bigger physical problems, and that's why it tips them over into problem feeding. So you have, I'm hoping, a picture that we can put up for families to look at what the difference between picky eating and problem feeding is, or is it something that you're going to have them download?
Yes, so we have a chart from Dr. Toomey that everyone can download. We'll have that integrated in our post at Kids Cook Real Food. And while you're talking, Dr. Toomey, I think, pull that up and screen share.
Oh, that would be
Absolutely.
marvelous if you could do that. I think that would be really helpful.
Sounds good. So just to kind of recap what you're saying, what I'm hearing you say is that, first of all, picky eating and problem feeding are different levels. Problem feeding, I would
Yes,
say, is more severe.
correct.
And if you put all the kids, like if you take 100% of kids and take all the picky and problem feeders, now we're like above 40% of all kids have some issues, right? 'Cause you said a third are
Well,
generally picky and
unfortunately, the way that the research looks at it is it looks at it predominantly only from the picky eater statistic
okay.
standpoint.
Well,
And so what happens is that third of kids that are picky eaters, what we find when you do longitudinal
hmm
studies is they stay picky for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years.
okay.
Those children who are staying picky and not outgrowing their picky eating, those are the kids who are really going to be your problem feeders.
Oh, okay.
So it's more that it's a third of kids are going to struggle with some kind of what probably should be called feeding issue.
Got it. It's not a
First time.
cumulative that the
Right.
problem are inside the picky third.
Right, right.
Okay.
And then 5 to 10% of those kids are going to be the problem feeders,
Okay.
and there will be a percent of the classic picky eater who will outgrow it, but only about 25% of the classic picky eater will actually outgrow it.
Got it.
So
Got it. That makes sense. And I do have, hopefully that's working, screen sharing
excellent,
the picky
excellent.
eaters versus problem feeders.
So one of the big things that differentiates if a child's a picky eater versus a problem feeder is how many foods the child eats on a regular basis.
Mhm.
And one of the things we suggest parents do, and you can do this even as we're talking here or after the program, is to take a piece of paper and put 3 columns on it. You're going to put proteins on one column, starches on another, fruits and vegetables in the third. And you're going to put on that list every food that your child eats on a regular basis. So they don't have to eat a lot of it. 2 to 3 bites, 80 to 90% of the time is good enough to go on the list.
Okay.
But what we need parents to understand is kids don't think about foods based on the food name. They think about foods as being same or different based on the oral motor skills that are needed to eat that food and the sensory features of that food. So for a child, we don't want parents on this list to just put down chicken, because if you put down chicken, well, a chicken nugget is a completely different food to a kid than chicken lunch meat, and that's completely different than chicken Kiev or chicken Parmesan,
Got it.
or just a plain baked chicken breast. Those are all completely different foods to kids. A
hmm
saltine cracker is actually a different food than a town cracker. A saltine cracker is square, it's white, yellow, it shatters in your mouth, and it's really salty. A town cracker is oval, it's kind of orangish, yellowish, it's buttery, and it melts in your mouth. A Pringles potato chip is a very different food to a kid than a Kettle potato chip. Corn on the cob is a completely different food than polenta. so we need parents to put the exact food on this list. Freeze-dried strawberries are a different food than dried strawberries, and that's a different food than fresh strawberries.
Wow.
And that's a different food than strawberry shortcake.
Yeah. I can literally see and feel the light bulbs going off all around the country right now and parents going, oh my goodness, I've always wondered why my kid doesn't just like chicken, all chicken. They only
Right.
eat this kind and not this kind. And I've all, I can hear my own voice saying to my kids, but you like this. It's the same thing as this,
No, it's not.
it's
No,
not. You
it's
like
not.
lasagna. It's the same thing. It's spaghetti.
No,
It's the
it's
same stuff.
not.
So this is like, it's like mind opening.
So
And I hope everyone's listening.
it all depends on how much it takes to chew it and what it feels like, smells like, tastes like, right? In the mouth. There are other senses involved. Most of us forget how foods sound in our head actually makes a difference. We have kids in our program who won't eat, and they'll tell you they won't eat that food because it's too noisy in their head. But the big ones we think about is how does it look? How does it smell? How does it taste? How does it feel in our mouth, right? And so if those things are really different, a child may eat strawberries in this form, but not in this form, right? Or
Got it.
dried mango is a heck of a lot easier to eat than actually fresh mango for some kids who don't like wet, slimy things. But
Gotcha.
if I can't chew very well, a fresh mango is going to be much easier for me to manage than a dried spear of mango, right?
Sure. And I
So
think all of us adults too, well, we have our preferences like that. Like I will never eat canned green beans, but I'll eat frozen sauteed. But if they get too cooked, then I don't like them anymore, right? Like we do this too as adults.
we
And so
do.
are we looking for categories then on this, categories of sensation?
No, but it's this first one is really for parents to make sure they're really and truly writing down every single solitary food individually, separately that their child eats. Now,
Wow.
if your child eats kids cereal, we are only going to give them 1 point if they're eating tricks and kicks and sugar pops. We hope our kids aren't eating that, but that is what some kids gravitate to.
Sure.
You only get 1 point for that, okay? Because they're
Oh, we
pretty
get a
much,
score.
they all taste the same. They all work the same in your mouth. They melt in your mouth, and they're all sweet. It's more thinking about about just how similar it is. If you eat, chicken anytizer kinds of things that are strips of chicken nugget, and you eat round chicken nuggets and dino chicken nuggets, you only get 1 point for chicken nuggets.
Got it.
So
Although there are some kids who will only eat the dinos.
there are,
Yeah.
and we can talk about those kids later. That's a visual issue.
Yes.
But on this first list, we really want every single food because most of us as parents think our children eat less than what our children actually do. And we think our kids have fewer foods in their food range than what they actually do. And kids who are picky eaters, once you count up all the foods on that list, you're going to see about 30 foods. And we got to make sure parents remember all the dairy products, all the egg products, nuts, seeds, beans, black beans, lentils, all those things are proteins, right? Fish. So we don't want parents to forget about foods either. But when you count up the foods on the list, the kids who are problem feeders generally have under 20 foods in their food repertoire when you do your list.
Yeah.
So that's going to be one of the things that differentiates. And I would recommend parents just go ahead and circle which one of these things best fits their child.
On this chart that you
On
can
this
print
chart.
out.
Yep. So we know that when kids' sensory systems aren't working very well, one of the things they want to do is something called a food jag. And a food jag is when your child wants to eat the same exact food prepared the same exact way over and over and over again. And the reason why they do that is because if you make me my perfect isosceles triangle grilled cheese sandwich, no crust, lightly toasted, no black specks, no brown specks, only one slice of only the orange Kraft American cheese, not Lucerne's, not the yellow, not two slices at 98.6 degrees,
Yep.
I don't have to turn on my sensory brain to eat that food, do I? So kids' food jag during those developmental transition time periods, 4 to 6 months, 12 to 14 months, 2 to 3, 5 to 6, 9 to 10, because part of those transition times are times when the sensory systems don't work as well. And when your sensory systems aren't working very well, it's a lot easier for me to fuss at my parent and get my parent to make me a perfect food than it is to work my sensory brain to eat that food.
It's like it's overly taxing at those
It is.
stages.
It's hard. And
Huh.
so, and sometimes as adults, we forget that kids are organized more simply than we are. We forget that if it hurts you, they cry, right? If
Right.
they're mad, they throw it on the floor. If they don't like something, they scream. If they don't like someone, they try to hit them. If it's hard work, little kids either run away or they cheat. And one of the ways to cheat is by fussing at you, my parent, and getting you to make me easier food.
Wow.
Now, I know we all know adults who still function at that level. However, after about 7, we should be overcoming some of that.
Okay.
But the problem with food jagging is for any of us, if we eat a food too many times in a row, too close together, we're eventually going to get sick and tired of that food, right? That's why a lot of us as grown-ups, have 3 half-eaten boxes of adult cereal in our cupboards because you get about a box and a half in and you get sick of that one, and then you got to switch to something else. But for those of us who are not problem feeders, those of us who are typical eaters and picky eaters, if we take about a 2-week break from a food, we'll come back and eat it again.
Okay.
That is not what problem feeders do. If problem feeders burn out on a food, if you give them a 2-week break, they will either act like they've never seen it before in their entire lifetime, even if they've just been living on peanut butter and honey sandwiches and wheat bread for the last 3 years as school lunch. They will act like they've never seen it before. Or they will act like it is the most disgusting thing on the planet you could ever feed them.
And the parents' heads just exploded because
Yes.
that's like just feels crazy to us. Yeah.
How can you do that? So what happens with problem feeders is oftentimes they started out when they were younger with more foods in their food repertoire, but then they burn out on pancakes, and then they burn out on macaroni and cheese, and then they burn out on chicken nuggets, and pretty soon we have a child who's 3, 4, 5 who only has 20 foods that they're eating, even if they were eating more when they were younger. And it's because of this food jagging and the burnout.
Okay.
And we're going to come back to that because one of the things we don't want to do as parents is ever let our kids food jag. So kids who are picky eaters, they will eat at least one food from every nutrition and texture group. Even if their only puree is applesauce, they at least have one. Even if their only fruit is applesauce, they at least have one. Right?
Okay.
Even if their only starch is bread, even if their only protein is peanut butter, they've got one. In each of the nutrition, each of the texture groups. With kids who are problem feeders, they will actually avoid entire categories of fruits and vegetables, or it won't eat a single food that's crunchy. They won't eat anything that's hard to chew. They're missing entire groups of foods. And that's one of the things you'll see when you look at the list that we've had our parents make, right? Is if they're missing entire categories of food.
Okay.
With a picky eater, if you give them a new food, they're going to fuss at you. They're going to be meh, meh, meh. So, but they'll settle down and they'll eventually be okay. Maybe they won't eat it, but they'll be okay with it on their plate. Not happy, but they're okay. That is not what problem feeders do. If you give a problem feeder a food that they don't want or they don't like or a new food, they have what we call nuclear meltdowns. So they throw, they cry, they scream, they crawl under the table, they leave the kitchen. That's something you're going to see those kids do. For picky eaters, oftentimes at a mealtime, they will sit and eat with us or their siblings, but they want some different kinds of foods. So everybody else is eating the lasagna, and their lasagna noodle is plain with just butter and Parmesan cheese on it. Or everyone else is eating the spaghetti and their noodles are plain with butter and Parmesan cheese. So they'll usually eat with us, but they're eating something a bit different. With kids who are problem feeders, they won't even eat with you. They don't want to eat with you. They want to eat by themselves. A lot of times they're not even eating at a table. They're not eating in the kitchen. A lot of these kids eat in front of the television in the living room.
Is that something, I mean, that's a choice. Is that something parents should try to curb, or is it more of a symptom rather than a cause?
It, it's It can be both.
Okay.
Oftentimes, what happens to us as parents, because we're so desperate to get our kids to eat, we start doing all sorts of things that is a short-term fix that creates a long-term problem.
Yep.
And letting our kids watch television, play on the iPhone, play on the iPad is a short-term fix that actually creates a long-term problem. Because if your child's constantly using the iPad or watching television or reading a book, what they're laying down brain pathways for during the meal is the book or the TV show. They're not laying down brain pathways for eating the foods you want them to eat. So we don't want families using those distractors. Now, that said, if your child's learned to eat by using a distractor, we don't want you to cut them off the distractor cold turkey either. You got to wean them off using the distractor, and it's a long, slow process. So
I can believe that. Is it, I mean, I like to talk to parents about mindful eating and how we should be thinking about what we're eating and experiencing it. And so that's okay. So that's kind of the solution. But if you're already stuck in the bad habit of screens or devices, pull them off slowly.
Right. Yeah, and you are exactly right. Again, it's one of the things we love about what you do, is that it is important that children be mindful eaters as well as adults. And as adults, we need to be mindful eaters so we're not overeating, right? But
that's different for kids.
It is different for kids.
Okay.
They need to be mindful eaters because they're still learning
how to eat
about food. And mindful eating in a child helps them actually learn about food. And instead of building one pathway for hot dogs in their brain, by doing mindful eating, they are building a complex of brain pathways so that they can eat any food on the planet, not just hot dogs. So that's why we love mindful eating for kids. And it's a great thing that you guys advocate. If we look at our picky eaters as parents, when we talk to our child's physician, sometimes we're going to be telling the doc, yeah, I can't get them to hardly eat, but maybe the next time we go in to see the doc, we're like, nah, they're doing better. And then the next time they're picky again. And then the next time they're okay. That's what we see with picky eaters. With problem feeders, every single time we're going to the well child check, we're like, we can't get this kid to eat. This child won't eat what we want them to. They're not eating enough. It's like constant and chronic that we're saying that. A lot of times we're saying, yeah, grandma can't get them to eat. The nanny can't get them to eat. They won't eat at school. Those are the kids who are going to be our problem feeders.
Sure.
And then the last step really has to do with learning to eat new foods. People think the way we eat is a two-step process. You sit down, you eat. That's actually not true. There are 32 steps in the process of learning to eat a new food.
32. That is 32. Impressive.
Now, kids who are really typically developing have no physical problems, no developmental issues. They can sometimes learn to eat a new food in 20 to 25 steps. And that's what the picky eaters will do as well. So they can skip some of those 32 steps. Kids who are problem feeders can't. And in fact, many times it's not only at least 32, but if your child, for example, is on the autism spectrum, your child likely has 40 to 60 steps in their process of learning to eat a new food. So the key to looking at picky eaters versus problem feeders, of course, is that if your child falls in the problem feeder range, they need to go into feeding therapy.
Right. There's no at-home solution. It's just too big. It's too big of
it is too big. You really want to find a feeding therapist in your community and get yourself and them some help. And in our clinic, we talk to the kids and the parents about it's not just kids who are in food school. Moms and dads are in food school too. And so it's both. Your picky eaters, as long as we think about how we set up our meals,
Okay.
what we serve them for meals, we as parents can actually help our children to the best of their physical and developmental abilities outgrow their picky eating.
Okay. This is very exciting, and I'm also slightly terrified because I've been teaching people how to raise more adventurous eaters and combat picky eating and the power struggles at the table, and some of the things that you have said are not true have totally come out of my mouth. So I'm humble enough to change that presentation at
Good
this
for
point, but
you.
I'm now nervous how much I'm going to have to change it. Hold up. Okay. Amazing information from Dr. K. Toomey. My mind is blown on the difference between picky eaters, problem feeders, and what you need to do. And I usually try to keep the healthy parenting connectors to like 30-ish minutes. Really good ones have gone around 45. But this one went to 90 minutes. And so we've got to cut it in half. And in the next episode of the Healthy Parenting Connector, I'll be back with Dr. Toomey to talk about practical steps parents can take at their table if they have a picky eater, not a problem feeder. And honestly, you guys, these practical steps are going to apply to pretty much all kids at some point in their life. So I highly encourage you to watch the next episode. And I hope that you took a lot of valuable information as well from this episode. I'm Katie Kimball for the Healthy Parenting Connector. I'll see you back next week with Dr. K. Toomey again.